The late afternoon sun hung low over the sleepy neighborhood of Whitefield Terrace, casting long amber shadows across perfectly aligned sidewalks and tightly trimmed lawns. It was the kind of place built on quietness, on the illusion of control. The kind of place where people watered their plants at the same hour every day and watched the street through their windows while pretending not to. The silence had weight here, a suburban politeness woven with tension just under the surface, like glass that had never been tested for cracks. Marina Chandler had not grown up in places like Whitefield. She was practical, sharp, a woman who had spent most of her adult life dealing with the unglamorous messes of municipal infrastructure. Pothole complaints, broken streetlights, over-budget drainage repairs. She had an instinct for anticipating when things would go wrong, for understanding systems from the inside out. When her best friend Aiden got injured, a scaffold collapsed during a routine home renovation, there wasn't even a second of hesitation. She quit her job the same week he was discharged, sold her condo in the city, and found them a home on the edge of the suburbs where there was air and trees and the quiet he so badly needed. Aiden had been a carpenter before the accident. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and notice which corner wasn't square, who found calm in precision. When he woke up in the hospital, waist down, paralyzed, it wasn't the pain that haunted him. It was the stillness. He never said it out loud, but Marina could see it in the way his eyes stopped lingering on his tools, in how quickly he turned away from television ads for power drills or DIY shows. So, when they found the old white house with the deep backyard and a wide wooden deck, she knew exactly what had to be done. With savings and some grants for disability access, they installed a basic manual deck lift. Nothing fancy. A steel-framed vertical platform elevator that ran along one of the back posts of the deck, hidden by hedges and shaded in the afternoon sun. It gave Aiden the freedom to move between the house and the yard without needing her assistance, and in a world that had stripped him of autonomy, that single freedom mattered more than most people could understand. The first few weeks were quiet. They got used to the new layout of the house. Aiden learned to move through door frames differently, to plan routes and avoid the loose slats on the ramp. Marina handled groceries, called the pharmacy, scheduled doctor visits. She had always been organized, but now it became survival. Every pill, every delivery, every scheduled inspection was logged and categorized. Still, they found their rhythm. They even planted a row of raised beds by the fence, filled them with basil and tomatoes and a few stubborn peppers. In the mornings, Aiden would roll out onto the deck, take the lift down, and water the garden while Marina worked at the kitchen table. The peace was delicate, but it was real. And then Karen happened. She first appeared 3 weeks after they moved in, wearing a pale salmon cardigan and walking a miniature schnauzer named Muffin. She didn't ring the doorbell. Instead, she stood at the edge of Marina's driveway until she was noticed. When Marina finally stepped outside, Karen smiled as if the encounter were incidental, as if she hadn't been standing there for the better part of 10 minutes waiting to be seen. "Oh, hi," she chirped. "I just wanted to say welcome. We don't often get new people on this street." Marina, though weary from a morning spent arguing with Aiden's insurance provider over medical chair specifications, smiled politely and thanked her. She didn't invite her in. She didn't need to. Karen didn't wait for an invitation. "I noticed you've installed something on your back deck," Karen said, eyes narrowing just slightly. "It's rather industrial, isn't it?" "It's a lift," Marina replied evenly. "For my friend." Karen tilted her head, eyes scanning Marina like a customs officer searching for undeclared intentions. "Oh, is he the one in the wheelchair? I see him sometimes from my upstairs window. Such a shame, poor man. Of course, I completely support accessibility. I just worry about the look of it. We've all worked very hard to maintain a certain visual harmony on this street." Marina didn't reply. She knew better than to start a battle she hadn't planned for. She simply nodded and excused herself. But something in Karen's gaze lingered. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The way she held the leash like a leash was something you used on people, too. After that, the air changed. The glances from passing neighbors grew colder. People no longer returned waves. Some even crossed the street when walking by. Marina noticed footprints in the garden soil one morning, but no plants were broken. Just a disturbance like someone had been watching. She began keeping the blinds down in the evenings. Aiden didn't mention it, but he stopped going outside as often. Once, she caught him staring out the window for 10 full minutes without blinking, the lift untouched behind him. Then, one Wednesday morning, Marina came out to find the lift mechanism covered in a sticky, tar-like substance. It smelled like engine degreaser mixed with something acidic, not enough to ruin the machinery, but enough to force a service inspection and delay its use for 3 days. Aiden said nothing. He simply stayed inside and stared at the wall while Marina cleaned it up with gloved hands and a sponge that stank for hours afterward. There was no proof, no witnesses, no cameras. Marina had wanted to install a security system when they first moved in, but the expense had felt unnecessary back then. Now it felt naive. She filed a police report anyway, though she knew how it would go. No suspects, they said. No pattern of harassment. The officer didn't even write anything down. The next day, Marina found a letter taped to the mailbox. No envelope. Printed in bold, all caps. Not everyone wants to look at your problem. Keep it inside where it belongs. That night, Marina didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, hands folded, listening to the creaks of the old house settle into the darkness. When the air was still, she heard the faint scratch of feet on gravel outside. Just a step or two, then silence. She didn't move, didn't speak, but in her mind, something shifted permanently. This wasn't just Karen being petty. This was deliberate, calculated. And if Karen wanted a war, Marina wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Not the way others might have. Not the way people like Karen always assumed their neighbors would. Marina came from the kind of world where you documented everything, where you didn't fight in anger. You fought in paperwork, process, and precision. She had once brought an entire office to its knees over a water billing error, and did it without raising her voice once. If Karen wanted to make this personal, then Marina would make it structural. But not in the way Karen would expect. Because Marina had a plan now, and it started with a replacement lift. Not just any lift, but one that would make sure Karen never walked past their yard unnoticed again. The first time Marina realized the situation had shifted from unpleasant to actively dangerous was early on a rainy Tuesday morning. She'd woken before dawn to the sound of Aiden moving around in the hallway. His chair made a distinctive soft creak against the laminate floor when he pushed himself quietly, trying not to disturb her. Normally, she would have let him go about his routine in peace, but something about the stiffness in his posture, the way he hovered by the back window with a hand braced on the sill, made her pause on her way to the coffee maker. She joined him without speaking. Outside, the rain had just begun, thin lines slicing through the glow of the yard lights. The platform lift, which had been dry and working flawlessly the day before, now sat twisted at an awkward angle. One of the lower brackets anchoring it to the deck frame had been completely sheared off. The rest of the lift was sagging, crooked, and visibly unsafe. Aiden didn't say a word, didn't curse, didn't groan. He simply stared. His silence was more unsettling than any outburst could have been. Marina stepped into rain boots and went outside with a flashlight, ignoring the drizzle and cold. The damage was clear immediately. The bolt hadn't snapped on its own. It had been cut, clean, deliberate. Someone had used a saw or a rotary tool to slice through the steel fastener, not the kind of work that could be done on impulse or without preparation. No scratch marks on the frame, no signs of struggle or misfire. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing. She took photos, measurements, and immediately called the manufacturer's emergency line. A technician confirmed what she already suspected. The break wasn't from fatigue or rust. It had been tampered with, and worse, the technician was hesitant to provide a written statement, even when she offered to pay. Liability concerns. No one wanted to be officially involved. Aiden refused to leave his room that day. When she brought him lunch, he barely touched it. "Don't replace it," he said, eyes not meeting hers. "Just let it go." It wasn't fear in his voice. It was resignation. That, more than anything, lit a fuse in Marina. She didn't respond right away. She waited until he fell asleep that afternoon and then opened her laptop. If someone wanted to remove the lift, fine. She'd remove it. But she wasn't going to make it easier for them. Instead of trying to repair what had been broken, Marina submitted a formal grant request to the State Disability Assistance Fund. Not for a basic replacement, but for an upgraded, industrial-rated platform lift designed for long-term outdoor use, with integrated safety features. She contacted the original installer and asked to be connected with someone experienced in adaptive mobility solutions for high-risk areas. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. That evening, a new letter arrived in the mailbox. This time, it was typed, folded neatly in a plastic sleeve, and unsigned. It read, "You've had your little moment. Take the hint. Some problems are meant to be kept behind closed doors." She put the letter in a plastic evidence sleeve and slipped it into a new file folder. She didn't take it to the police. She'd already been through that cycle. She instead sent it via email directly to the local Department of Civil Rights Compliance, attaching a summary of the incident with the platform and a copy of her grant request. She included no accusations, no conclusions, just facts. Nothing activates a slow-moving bureaucracy like the suggestion that they might be liable for inaction. It wasn't immediate justice, but it was leverage. And leverage was power. In the days that followed, Marina went about business as usual, but something in her movements became sharper. She scheduled consultations with contractors, and when asked what the platform was for, she answered bluntly: visibility, control, and legal compliance. Most simply nodded, careful not to get involved. But one of them, a younger contractor named Luis, new to the county and unaware of neighborhood politics, raised an eyebrow and said, "What kind of lift plays a warning sound when people get too close?" She answered without blinking. "The kind that keeps people alive when no one else gives a damn." The installation was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During that time, Marina documented everything. Not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. Footprints near the deck. Dog waste thrown into the garden beds. A freshly scratched key line on the siding near Aiden's bedroom window. She didn't report these things. She just logged them. Screenshot. Timestamp. Catalog. Every small act was a puzzle piece, and when the time came, she intended to have the whole picture. Aiden remained withdrawn, though she caught him watching from the hallway as she met with the installation crew. He didn't interfere, didn't ask questions, but something about the way his fingers tapped nervously against the wheels of his chair told her he knew this wasn't just about access anymore. It was a battle of space, of territory, of dignity. 2 days before the new platform was to be installed, Marina received a formal letter from a local attorney. It was bland, filled with vague language and hedged liability, but the implication was clear. A neighbor had raised concerns that the new lift design would introduce excessive noise and visual intrusion. The letter urged her to reconsider the installation in favor of a more discreet option and offered to mediate a more appropriate solution through community dialogue. There was no name, no signature from a neighbor, just the firm's letterhead and a P.O. box address. She forwarded it to the compliance officer she'd been emailing. This time, she added a short note. "I have not publicly announced the details of this installation. The only people who know are the contractor, the fund coordinator, and myself. I assume this contact was made based on private observation. I believe this now qualifies as sustained intimidation against a disabled resident." The next morning, she received a reply. Short, but promising. "Thank you. Please retain all documentation. I am forwarding this to the district civil council." It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve flashing lights or arrests. But to Marina, it felt like the first shift in weight, the beginning of a pressure imbalance. She didn't need a fight. She just needed momentum. The platform arrived in an unmarked delivery truck. A sleek, reinforced structure with a low-profile housing, pressure sensors, and a motion-activated proximity alarm. The installer, a soft-spoken man in his 50s with years of experience modifying buildings for veterans and trauma patients, walked her through the safety features. At the end of the orientation, he paused and asked, "You want the alarm active all the time, or just at night?" Marina thought for a long moment. "All the time," she said. "I want anyone approaching that deck to know they're being noticed." The installer nodded without question. No judgment, just acknowledgement. As he packed his tools, Marina watched the new platform lower and rise, smooth as silk, the mechanical hum whispering through the air like a quiet warning. That evening, Karen returned. She didn't knock. She didn't shout. She simply stood on the sidewalk with her dog and stared. The new platform gleamed in the setting sun. And then, as she stepped a few feet closer, just into the outer edge of the motion detection range, the system let out a single, sharp chirp. Not loud, not angry, just unmistakably alert. Karen stopped mid-step. Her dog barked once. She squinted at the platform as if trying to decipher whether this was intentional, whether it was legal. She didn't say a word. She simply turned and walked away. Marina watched from the window, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. She had not won anything yet. But she had made something very clear. This space was no longer passive. It was no longer vulnerable. It was active. And it was watching. The platform stood quiet for the next 3 days. The sensor, although subtle, chirped whenever someone crossed into the designated proximity zone. Its sound was not violent or jarring, more like the high note of a bird's cry filtered through machinery. Marina had calibrated it to that exact pitch after an hour of testing with the installer. Not too invasive, but unmistakably present, the kind of tone you couldn't pretend you didn't hear. In the daytime, it blended into the background of rustling leaves and humming sprinklers. At night, it was a sentinel. Aiden hadn't said much since the installation. He used the lift, but in a cautious way, still visibly coiled as though expecting a trap at the base of it. Marina didn't press him. The damage done to his sense of safety would not be undone by mechanical upgrades or municipal letters. She focused instead on holding the perimeter steady. Her vigilance was not paranoia, it was maintenance. Order, routine, and awareness were her weapons. She adjusted to this new pace like it was a job, because in many ways, it was. Then, without warning, the neighborhood began to shift. It started with the garbage cans. Marina found hers tipped over 3 times in 1 week, each time precisely on Monday mornings, just before the collection truck arrived. The contents weren't strewn or scattered. They were simply upended, dumped, and left to be manually rebagged. Twice, the bins were dragged to the edge of Aiden's garden beds and left in the damp soil, crushing the basil and pulling clumps of dirt over the stone border. She checked the camera, newly installed above the back door and tied into a basic DVR setup. But the footage showed nothing. Someone was approaching from a blind angle outside the sensor range, careful enough not to trigger the chirp. That required knowledge, patience, intent. Aiden noticed, of course. He said nothing about the damage, but he began wearing his phone in a shoulder holster, even inside the house. He kept a flashlight clipped to the side of his chair. Subtle signs, barely visible to anyone else, But Marina knew the language of people preparing for escalation. She had seen it in municipal disputes, in tenants resisting eviction, in staff pushed past exhaustion. It was the silence of people who had decided to endure, but not to forget. The next event wasn't subtle. One Thursday morning, just past 6, Marina stepped out the front door to find a laminated flyer duct-taped to her mailbox. It read, "Protected status doesn't mean you get to rewrite the rules. This is a community, not a shelter. Consider others." There was no signature, no organization, no point of contact. Just those 3 sentences in black Helvetica, spaced evenly and printed with professional alignment. She peeled it off without ceremony and folded it in half, slipping it into the same folder as the first typed threat. Then she went inside, made coffee, and began drafting an email to her compliance contact. She didn't ask for an investigation. She simply attached the image and logged the timestamp. That afternoon, she received an unexpected call. Not from the city, but from the insurance company that had funded the original grant. The voice on the other end was cordial, overly so, and full of scripted apologies. There had been a concern raised, they said, regarding the lift's noise output. Not a complaint exactly, just a reported observation that had triggered a follow-up review. Was she aware that the platform's alarm function could be considered an environmental noise disruption under certain neighborhood ordinances? Marina didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. Instead, she asked for the documentation that had prompted the review. The woman paused. There wasn't a formal report, she said, just a flagged note of concern passed through the discretionary review board. Marina thanked her politely and ended the call. Then she sat down and began to trace the paper trail. She contacted the manufacturer directly and requested a technical noise profile of the platform. She pulled the local ordinance for noise violations and highlighted the clause that exempted medical safety equipment from regulation. She printed both documents and mailed them, certified and tracked to the insurance board with a note that read, "For your records, no further action required." She had learned a long time ago that when bureaucracy tries to get clever, you don't meet it with emotion. You meet it with paper. And if they were going to start poking at her installation with procedural sticks, she was going to make sure they hit nothing but reinforced walls. Aidan was quiet that night, eating dinner with the television on but the volume low. At one point, Marina caught him staring at the platform through the back window, the glass reflecting soft shadows across his face. "You don't have to keep fighting," he said finally. "We can move. We've done it before." But Marina shook her head. "We're not renters anymore. We're not temporary. That's what they're counting on. That will fold and vanish." He didn't argue. He simply nodded and went back to his food. The next escalation came in the form of whispers. Marina began to notice neighbors speaking in lower voices when she passed. Conversation stopped when she approached the mailbox. She caught the same 2 people, an older woman and a tall man with a shaved head, standing at the corner of her lawn 3 separate times over a week, holding coffee and staring without pretending to do anything else. She made eye contact once. Neither smiled. The final straw was not violent. It was banal, surgical, and insidious. Marina returned from a grocery run to find her front door wide open. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, no signs of forced entry. But the deadbolt was turned all the way open, and the alarm system, basic, new, and well-reviewed, had been manually disabled at the control panel. Someone had entered, either with a copy of the key or the code, and walked through her space without leaving a trace. She didn't call the police. She called a locksmith. Within an hour, all the locks were replaced. She added a secondary code pad inside the back door, then quietly installed a backup battery camera in the main hallway. She didn't tell Aidan. There was no point in adding to his tension unless there was something concrete to act on. That night, she stayed up late. The sensor chirped twice around midnight. The camera caught nothing, but the sound was enough. The next morning, she walked into her kitchen, made a pot of coffee, and opened her laptop. She drafted a short email to the compliance officer, subject line, "Documented escalation." In the body, she wrote, "Entry occurred. No theft. System bypassed. Platform remains functional. Lift perimeter breached multiple times during the week. Behavioral pattern consistent with harassment via coordinated pressure. No direct confrontation yet, but indicators suggest planned persistence." She included the photos of the bent trash bins, the key scratches on the siding, and a still image of the open front door taken from her internal camera. She did not demand action. She did not accuse anyone by name. Then she added a single line at the bottom. "This is no longer about property aesthetics." And she hit send. By the time the compliance officer responded to her latest message, Marina already knew she was approaching a breaking point. Not emotional, but structural. The pressure had shifted from passive aggression to something darker and more deliberate, something calculated to unsettle, to provoke, to dismantle her calm by inches. What frustrated her most wasn't the lack of confrontation but the absence of accountability. No one yelled, no one threw rocks, no one left fingerprints. And that made it harder to strike back because it was a ghost they were fighting, one with just enough plausible deniability to hide behind fences and closed blinds. The officer's email was professional and succinct. It thanked Marina for her thorough documentation and confirmed that the district civil council had opened a preliminary inquiry into environmental and community harassment related to disability access conflict. That phrase alone confirmed what Marina had long suspected. This wasn't just seen as an isolated neighborly disagreement. It had escalated into a recognized pattern, one that institutions were finally forced to acknowledge, if not act upon with any immediate consequences. It was a start, but it wasn't a solution, and she needed something tangible now, something that made it clear she wasn't waiting around to be pushed out like an inconvenient tenant. So she made the platform louder. It was subtle at first, a slight adjustment to the decibel threshold of the motion sensor chirp, just enough to ensure that anyone within 6 feet would hear it clearly, even if they wore headphones or pretended not to notice. Then she added a low-frequency pulse under the main tone, the kind of sound that didn't register as loud but clung to your skin like vibration, a sonic pressure point designed not to cause pain, only discomfort. The result was immediate. People still walked by, but they walked faster. Karen, who had taken to strolling by in the evenings with a different small dog, began wearing earbuds and avoiding eye contact altogether. Then, for 3 days, everything was quiet. No garbage can sabotage, no flyers, no unexplained entries or power surges. Even the garden beds remained untouched. Aiden began spending more time outside again. He rolled onto the deck every afternoon around 5, reading or just sitting quietly with the dog Marina had adopted from a rescue 3 months earlier. It was a brindled mutt named Cutter, quiet but alert, who had taken to following Aiden like a shadow. The air felt almost tolerable again, the kind of calm that came not from resolution, but from a predator retreating to plan its next strike. And then came the complaint. It arrived in the form of a letter from the county assessor's office, a formal notification that an anonymous tip had been submitted regarding unpermitted electrical modifications and structural inconsistencies related to the lift installation. The language was stiff and hedged, clearly templated, but the message was unmistakable. Someone was trying to get the county to classify the platform as an illegal construction, possibly triggering a fine or even forced removal. Marina didn't panic. She went straight to her filing cabinet, pulled out the stamped permit approvals from both the accessibility department and the structural safety inspector, and scanned them along with installation invoices and signed clearance reports. She submitted everything the same day, including an affidavit from the installer confirming that all equipment met local and federal code. Then, anticipating the next move, she requested a courtesy walkthrough by a compliance officer, not to defend herself, but to go on the offensive. The inspector came 2 days later. A quiet man with graying hair and thick glasses, he took measurements, examined the electrical connections, reviewed the sensor calibration, and nodded with an air of technical boredom. Marina stayed silent the entire time, handing him documents when asked, saying only what was necessary. At the end, he looked up from his clipboard and said, "It's probably your neighbor. We get these every now and then. People using the building department as a weapon." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. He handed her a stamped verification letter on the spot. That evening, she placed a copy of the signed clearance in a laminated frame and screwed it to the side of the lift, just beneath the control box. In bold letters, it read, "Inspected and approved. Compliant with ADA and local code." She didn't care who read it. She wanted them to see it. Wanted it to be clear that this was not a loophole to exploit, not a flaw to target. But the complaint had done something else. It had crossed a line. It wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was an attempt to remove something legally protected, something Aiden needed not just for convenience but for existence. That realization settled over Marina like cold iron. There was no longer room for passive reaction. She had to respond in kind, not with violence, but with permanence. So she called the platform company again and requested an additional feature, something that hadn't come standard but had been discussed during the original consultation. A motion-triggered sound module, programmable with custom tones, that could be installed into the base of the lift system and pointed outward toward the property line. It wasn't intended to be a warning device. It was designed as a deterrent, an audio marker that created presence, like dogs barking behind a gate. "What kind of sound?" the technician asked. Marina considered this for a long time. Something institutional, impersonal, authority-adjacent. The technician offered a few options. Marina chose a digital siren tone, the kind used in weather alerts and restricted area alarms. Not too loud, but unmistakably linked to control. It wouldn't violate any noise codes. It wouldn't be constant. But every time someone stepped within 4 feet of the lift's detection zone, it would emit a short, sharp signal. Not angry, not chaotic, just unmistakably official. The installation was fast. The activation was immediate. And it worked. Karen passed by the next evening, slower than usual, and stepped just close enough for the siren to chirp its 1-second warning. She froze, turned, stared at the platform like it had spoken her name, and then, without a word, she turned around and walked the long way around the block. Marina watched her from the window, not smiling, not celebrating, just absorbing the data. This was no longer a matter of neighborly peace. It was a campaign. And now, for the first time, the boundaries were being enforced not with fences or appeals, but with mechanisms. Hard-coded, indifferent, and utterly compliant with the law. Later that night, as Marina sat beside Aiden on the deck while Cutter lay at his feet, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of footsteps retreating down the sidewalk. The sensor chirped once. The siren did not activate. Whoever it was, they had stayed just outside the line. Aiden looked over at her and finally said, "Whatever this thing is, it makes them nervous." Marina nodded slowly. "Good. Let it." By the start of the 3rd week following the platform's siren installation, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted from hostile to charged. Not noisy or chaotic. No one had the audacity to be overt, but there was now a sense of containment, like a pressurized room with no vents. People still mowed their lawns, walked their dogs, and waved across driveways to familiar faces. But around Marina's property, the mood was clinical. Avoidance had replaced aggression, as though her house had become a kind of static voltage, dangerous only if touched. And yet she knew from experience that silence didn't mean surrender. It meant something else was coming. The first sign came not in the form of vandalism, but through municipal channels. Again, a second letter arrived in a plain envelope, this time from the Zoning Commission. notifying her that an anonymous complaint had triggered a parcel review. According to the letter, the commission had reason to believe that a portion of her deck extended 6 inches past the allowable setback line for her property. It was a bureaucratic flex, a technicality no one cared about unless provoked. The deck had been there when she bought the house. It had passed every prior inspection, but someone had gone through the trouble of requesting the original plans and identifying a theoretical encroachment, 6 inches. She knew what it meant. Karen, or someone else aligned with her, had decided that the Siren changed the stakes. They couldn't dismantle the lift with tools, couldn't scare her into removing it with whispers or legal ambiguity, so now they'd escalate upward, weaponizing codes, policy, enforcement. Instead of a fight between neighbors, it was becoming a chess game played with bureaucracy. And Marina had spent enough time inside city systems to know just how long the game could go on. She called the zoning office directly and asked to speak with the reviewing officer. He was polite, disinterested, and clearly just checking a box. "We're required to respond to any formal complaint," he said. "We'll send someone to measure. It probably won't lead to anything." But Marina knew better. She spent the next 3 hours pulling property surveys, photographic archives, and past permit records. She scheduled a private land survey, out of pocket, and sent a copy of the request to the zoning board preemptively. Then she hired a title expert to verify that no amendments had ever been filed on her boundary lines. If they wanted war by technicality, she'd bury them in accuracy. And, just as she predicted, the day before the scheduled inspection, she received a new document, slid into her mailbox with no postage and no return address. A signed petition, ostensibly from other neighbors, requesting the removal of the electronic alert device installed on the rear platform, which produces disruptive noises at unpredictable intervals and contributes to neighborhood unease. It bore 8 signatures. 4 of those were names she recognized. One was her immediate next-door neighbor, a retired police officer who hadn't said a word to her since she moved in. She scanned the petition and sent it to her compliance contact along with a note. "Coordinated pressure is expanding. Recommend official review of false representation and fabricated nuisance claims. Preparing ADA retaliation claim if this persists." The response came quickly this time. "Understood. We've flagged the case for legal review." It was progress, but it didn't stop the petition from circulating. A week later, someone left a stack of them outside the local grocery store, on the community bulletin board, and the windshield of Marina's car. The wording had changed slightly. It now accused her of creating an acoustically hostile zone incompatible with residential zoning expectations and implied that she was harboring industrial equipment for non-domestic use. The language wasn't legal, but it was specific enough to confuse a casual reader. And that was the point. Not to convince the city, but to turn her neighbors into quiet allies for Karen. Aidan began staying inside again. Not because of fear, but because of frustration. "This isn't about me anymore," he said one morning, eyes on the TV as muted headlines scrolled past. "It's about someone who hates that she can't control what she sees." Marina didn't disagree, but she couldn't let it go. Every new move pushed the line further, and if she gave up ground now, it would undo months of silent work. The breaking point came one night when Marina returned from a late meeting with a local accessibility advocate. Her driveway was full of sand. Not dumped, not in piles, but layered, spread thin and even, covering the entire pavement like a strange beach. It was the kind of trick she'd seen used by developers to test drainage, or by protesters trying to ruin filtration grates. It wasn't random. It was a signal. She parked across the street and walked through the sand without flinching. At the front door, she saw a series of footprints, small, sharp-edged, barefoot, probably from a child. But what child walks across someone's yard barefoot in the dark, leaving perfect, unhurried tracks? It was a message. She didn't call the police. Instead, she opened her laptop and typed a formal request to the district attorney's community justice coordinator. Her subject line was clear: ongoing pattern of coordinated civil harassment involving false reporting, code weaponization, and intimidation targeting disabled household, requesting a formal inquiry into pattern behavior and community disruption. She attached every file she had, 43 pages of documentation organized by date and severity, not as accusations, as evidence. No narratives, no rants. Just timestamps, quotes, official letters, photos, statements, maps, the language of the system, unassailable. 2 days later, the community coordinator responded. The message was brief but weighted. I've reviewed the file. We'll be discussing with legal and public safety liaison. Please do not engage directly with the complainants. We'll reach out with next steps. Marina didn't smile, didn't breathe easier, but she marked the message with a green flag in her inbox and printed a hard copy for the folder she now kept by the door. The next day, Karen made her first direct move in weeks. At 6:30 in the evening, she walked up Marina's front steps holding a clipboard, not sneaking, not observing, standing directly in view of the motion camera, her dog at her side, her smile wide and unconvincing. I thought we could talk neighbor to neighbor, she said as Marina opened the door but didn't step out. All this noise, all this legal back and forth, it's getting exhausting, don't you think? Wouldn't it be easier if you just made some compromises? Marina didn't respond immediately. She let the silence grow dense between them. You mean, give you what you want, she said eventually. Karen's expression didn't waver. I mean, consider how your choices affect everyone else. Your friend's condition doesn't have to be a burden on the rest of us. There are more appropriate places for people with his needs. It was the closest thing to a confession Marina had heard, and it was enough. She reached behind the door, picked up the evidence folder, and held it up. I've already sent all of this to the DA's office, she said quietly. You're not going to like what happens next. Karen stared at the folder, then at Marina, her smile slowly dissolving. She turned and left without another word. The siren chirped as she stepped past the detection zone, sharp and piercing in the evening air. And for once, Marina let herself smile. It was the sound of a line drawn and held. It started with the smell. At first it was faint, just a strange, acrid tinge in the early morning air that Marina couldn't quite place. She assumed it was fertilizer, some neighbor's attempt at reviving their lawn, or maybe someone burning brush at the edge of the district despite the seasonal restrictions. But by mid-morning, the scent had thickened into something unmistakably chemical, like scorched plastic and sulfur, the kind of odor that made the back of your throat itch and eyes burn just slightly. Cutter, the dog, paced near the deck door, ears flat, hackles raised. Marina stepped outside and immediately felt the heat. The trash bin by the side of the house was scorched. Its side had collapsed inward, half melted, blackened, and bubbling in places. The contents, mostly cardboard and packaging from recent medical deliveries, were charred but not completely consumed. The fire hadn't spread beyond the bin, but the concrete beneath was stained, and the siding of the house bore faint smoke trails rising toward the eaves. She called the fire department without hesitation, giving the dispatcher a crisp description and making clear there were no active flames. 2 units arrived in less than 10 minutes. They ran a quick suppression sweep, then moved into standard investigation mode. The battalion chief, a middle-aged man with the weary posture of someone who'd seen too much of everything, nodded as she explained what she'd found. "Looks like some kind of accelerant," he said after a pause, glancing at the residue. "We'll have to file a report. Could be vandalism. Could be worse." When the police arrived an hour later, Marina didn't bother waiting for a knock. She met them halfway down the walkway, folder in hand, everything already printed, highlighted, and tabbed. The officer, young, polite, and visibly uncomfortable, read her statement carefully. "You're saying someone lit this intentionally? Any suspects?" "No names," Marina said calmly. "But there's a documented pattern of behavior. This isn't the first incident. It's the most dangerous." Aiden didn't come out of his room. He'd seen the fire from his window and hadn't spoken since. Marina knew the silence wasn't about fear. It was guilt. He blamed himself, even if the cause had nothing to do with him directly. The fire hadn't reached the deck. It hadn't damaged the lift. But the implication was clear. Proximity. It was a warning. Not a message for Marina, but for him. When the police left, Marina called the community justice coordinator again and left a message. Then she called her attorney, newly retained from a referral list provided by the Advocacy Center. She requested immediate action on the civil harassment inquiry and asked to begin preparing an ADA retaliation claim, naming both the neighbors she suspected and any others who had signed the petition. That night, she didn't sleep. The air felt different, heavy, reactive. Not just tense, but charged. Like something had crossed from pressure into recklessness. At 3:15 a.m., the sensor chirped. Then the siren. 1 second burst. Then silence. She sat up instantly. Checked the monitor. Nothing on camera, no motion, no lingering figure. But Cutter, asleep on the rug, was already standing, growling low and steady. She waited 20 minutes. Nothing more. The next morning, the fire inspector returned with a field technician. They collected residue samples and asked her to describe her recent conflicts again. She showed them the previous reports, the flyers, the photos of the trash cans, the petition. The technician took photos of the siding and the melted bin, then offered to connect her with a private fire safety consultant. By afternoon, she'd installed a secondary external motion light above the trash area and repositioned one of her cameras to cover the angle previously left exposed. But that wasn't enough. She needed to make it clear that this wasn't a back and forth. So she filed a restraining order request. It wasn't for Karen by name, yet. The paperwork named an unknown party suspected of repeated escalating harassment and property sabotage, tied to ongoing documentation provided to city and state officials. The attorney ensured it was structured to trigger automatic review should the suspect be identified through investigation. Later that evening, a plain gray sedan parked across the street from her home. It didn't move for over an hour. No one exited. No one rolled down a window. She called it into the non-emergency line, gave the license plate, and left it at that. 20 minutes later, the car drove away. The following day, she received an unexpected letter. Not through her mailbox, but delivered by courier. It was a cease and desist, authored by a private legal firm representing concerned residents of Whitefield Terrace, demanding that she immediately deactivate and remove all sound-emitting devices from the exterior of her home under threat of a civil nuisance claim. The letter cited no actual violations, no statute, no recorded ordinance breach. It was pure theater. But that was the mistake. Because now it was written. Marina scanned it, highlighted the most damning phrase. Failure to comply will result in joint neighborhood action, and forwarded it to the district council, the compliance officer, and her own lawyer. The reply from legal was terse but unmistakable. Threat of joint neighborhood action in context of ADA-protected equipment will be investigated as possible collective retaliation. Keep all communications. That same evening, she added a new recording to the lift's system. Instead of the sharp siren tone, the next person to trigger the motion sensor heard a short, automated voice. Federal law prohibits harassment or intimidation of disabled residents. All movements on this property are logged and reported. The voice wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was official, institutional, cold. That night, someone tossed a handful of pebbles at her window. She didn't flinch. She didn't call anyone. She simply switched on every exterior light, stepped onto the back deck and stood silently next to the platform, arms crossed, eyes on the street. The neighborhood was empty. The sensor chirped once, and nothing moved. The silence that followed the night of the pebbles was unlike any that had come before. It wasn't tense or watchful. It was sterile, almost rehearsed, like the hush of a place waiting for formal closure. For the first time in weeks, there were no flyers, no strange footsteps near the garden beds, no repositioned trash cans or glances from porches. The neighborhood didn't change so much as it went blank. Neighbors didn't speak. Cars parked in different spots. Even the children who used to ride scooters near the corner avoided her street entirely. It was the stillness of something exhausted, something stripped of plausible deniability and now clinging to distance out of fear of exposure. Karen was no longer walking her dog past the house. The petition disappeared from the grocery store bulletin board. The gray sedan never returned. Instead, one morning, Marina received an envelope in the mail, certified with return receipt required. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter from the district attorney's office informing her that a formal inquiry had been opened into acts of coordinated civil harassment targeting her address based on sustained documentation and recent fire-related vandalism. It was not yet a criminal case, but it had a number. And once a case had a number, it no longer disappeared quietly. She didn't cheer. She didn't call Aiden with the news. She simply slid the paper into the growing legal folder and returned to her task list for the day. A week later, the house next door was listed for sale. No signs, no agents knocking for introductions. Just a sudden influx of surveyors, inspectors, and a quiet crew cleaning the gutters. Karen was gone by the end of the month. No confrontation, no announcement. Just an early morning moving truck that arrived without warning and left in silence. Marina watched them load the boxes without stepping outside. Aiden didn't even ask who was leaving. He knew. When the final box was gone and the door clicked shut behind the last mover, Marina walked to the edge of her property, stood beside the platform, and checked the sensor range. Then she stepped back inside and turned off the automated voice alert. It had done its job. She left the siren in place, not out of fear, but as a reminder. In the weeks that followed, things changed subtly. Aiden began going outside again in the early mornings, sitting in the sun with Cutter beside him. He didn't rush back indoors when footsteps passed. He let the lift carry him down to the garden without pausing to check behind him. He began asking about planting again, whether the peppers could be salvaged, whether there was still time in the season for root vegetables. They weren't big moments, but they were real. One afternoon, Marina received a handwritten note in her mailbox. No envelope, just a folded card. Inside was a simple message. "We didn't know how bad it was. Thank you for standing firm." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. The next time she went to the hardware store, she bought new paint for the platform base. Not because it needed it, but because it felt like time. She chose a dark slate gray, clean and subdued, and added a single brass plaque to the lower rail. It read, "Compliant, protected, permanent." By the time the new neighbors moved into Karen's old house, a couple in their 40s with a teenage son and no dogs, the platform was as much a fixture of the yard as the garden beds and the bench under the oak. No one asked about it. No one stared. On their first day, the new neighbor waved from the driveway. Marina waved back. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was peace. The siren still chirped once whenever someone stepped too close, just enough to remind them. This boundary wasn't negotiable anymore.